Welcome back to Prime for Battle, and today we're going to be working on Kragnos, the end of empires, the god of earthquakes. This one was requested by one of my viewers, and I'd needed Kragnos for some time to join my Sons of Bahamut army, so I decided to pick him up and pop him up on the channel. So strap in, I hope you enjoy. You'll see the list of paints that I've used on the screen right now, and I hope you have as much fun painting yours as I did painting my Kragnos. Now I started with a Chaos Black Prime, and then I've used Rhinox Hide, and I've fairly heavily applied that over the entirety of the body, including all the hair and everything, and also on the weapons and pretty much the whole model. And I've just used a dry brush, but not gone too light on the paint, just nice and steady coat over the entirety of the model. From here, I've done a dry brush of Doombull Brown, and I've applied that over all of the skin areas and the hair. So start off a little bit lighter and just work up the layers of the dry brush. Less is more. You can always build up more layers later if you've gone too light, but going too heavy on a dry brush can be difficult to reverse. Now I'm doing a dry brush of Scrag Brown, and similar to the last step, I'm going to apply this over the hair and the skin and start with gradual layers and build it up over time, just so that you don't accidentally do it too heavy and spoil some of the detail. Now in this step, before continuing with the dry brushing, I've actually done a layer of Reikland Flesh Shade over the entirety of the skin, just to help blend those previous layers together a bit before continuing with a little bit more dry brushing over the top. Just find the flesh shade will help sort of tie the colors together and smooth it out a little bit for my liking. Now getting back into the dry brushing, we're using some Deathclaw Brown. We're applying that over the underside of his body, so under the legs, the inside of the legs, and his underbelly, and then also on his chest and arms and face and sort of front of his neck, all that sort of forward facing lighter skin on his sort of more humanoid torso. What you may want to do with this as well, if you're having trouble getting your dry brush into some of the recess sort of areas, maybe just use a smaller brush and just sort of dab it lightly into those areas where it can be a little bit harder to reach with your dry brush. And in this step, we will also go over the fur, so the tail and his sort of mane on his back of his head and around his ankles as well, to start highlighting that hair. Now I'm going to use some rat skin flesh, and I'm going to focus the dry brushing really on his sort of chest and arms with this, as well as his face. I will touch a little bit of the hair, and then what I'll also do is with a finer brush, I'll actually on his face just highlight some of the facial areas a little bit with a little bit more accuracy, so around the eyebrows and the lips and nose and whatnot, just to help make sure that they're really getting caught accurately. Now in this final step of dry brushing, we're going to use some Ungor flesh, and similarly to the last step, we're just going to very lightly dry brush that over his torso and chest and arms, and also his face. And again, I'll then go back over his face with a fine tip brush and just pick out some of the areas that need highlighting. You can see I'm just picking out the eyebrows and the areas around the eyes in particular, his nose, his cheeks, his lips, around his ears, etc. Even some of the muscles that are on his chest and abdomen, I'll just patch some of the edges or the very tops of those muscles, just where the light would hit, just to add a little bit of highlight. Now, in 2 quick steps, I'm going to first use some Volupus Pink to do his tongue, which has already been highlighted somewhat from the dry brush of the skin tones we've used. So a quick coat of Volupus Pink will do the job for the tongue. Then I'm going to use some Druchii Violet around the face and mouth areas. I'm just going to use a very thin amount just to sketch around the eyes and nose, around the inside of the lips, the gums and the mouth area, just to add a bit of a pinky flesh hue underneath all of the brown and sort of flesh tone colors that we've used previously. Moving on to the horns and the bones that are sticking out at various points all over his body. I'm going to use some Ushabti bone and just dry brush that over the entirety of the horns. You may need to use a smaller brush for some of the horns around his body, or even a fine brush, and just sort of sketch some of the lines in, just so that you're not going over other areas of the body that you've already done with other colors. Now I'm going to go over all of those bones and horns with Basilicanum Grey, just to really bring the color back down to a blackish sort of look, but with the undertones of those highlights sort of visible underneath the sort of semi-transparent coat with the Basilicanum Grey. So I think this really helps to give it a much subtler highlight and sort of ties it all, the tones together on those horns. Now I'm using some Gore Grunter fur for all of the hair and furs on him. And what I'm doing as I get close to the end where the hair meets the skin, just give the brush a little bit of a washout and then leaving just a little bit of water. You can see I'm just dragging that contrast paint up a little bit onto the skin area, which sort of thins it out, sort of feathers it up the skin, which sort of helps to blend the colors together a bit without such a harsh transition between the two. Now moving on to the armor plates, I'm using some Celestra Grey. I'm just very carefully dry brushing that across the various chains, armor, bangles, and his weapon and the handles for his shield. Now in retrospect, it may have been easier to do this at an earlier step, but if you use a small brush and just sort of drag it across the surface with just a little bit of paint on it, it will sort of pick out the edges as if you're sort of edge highlighting. So just be very careful and take your time. You don't need to catch the entirety of the armor pieces. It's really just picking out some of the areas and the edges that we've previously caught, and just changing the tone a little bit from all the skin tones that have been dry brushed across the armor. Now we're going to use one of my very favorite contrast paints, Pterodon Turquoise, and I'm going to apply this over all of the armor and chains. And with the dry brushing of the skin tones and the Celestra Grey in the previous steps, that's really going to show through as different tones and highlights of green underneath all of the Pterodon Turquoise layers that we do over the armor. Now I'm going to use some Strachan Green, and I'm going to dry brush this over all of the areas that I did with Pterodon Turquoise. Again, with some of these areas being smaller details, I'd suggest using smaller dry brushes or even a old fine tip brush that you don't care about anymore, that you can be a little bit rough with, dragging across the smaller areas. If you need to, you can even just dab it a little bit on some of the areas that are sort of being hit by the light. But what we want to do is just pick out all the edges and I'll go a little bit harder on some of the areas that are more sort of catching the light. Now, to finish this ancient metals look that I'm going for, I'm using some Canoptech alloy. I'm just going to dry brush this firstly fairly heavily around the end of the mace, but also just lightly dry brush and dab it across all the areas of metal. So all the green areas that we've just done, go a little bit heavier on the chains maybe. Similarly again, use a smaller brush for the smaller areas and just work your way around the model slowly, just adding a bit of this underside sort of worn metal look to the green, which sort of I hope I've captured a look of sort of aged, discolored ancient metals. Now, just coming back to some of the smaller details, I've used some Corax White to do the eyes with some Abaddon Black pupils. I've then also used some Ushabti bone to pick out the little bits of bone dangling off some of his armor, and then also the nails on his hand, and then over that bone and the nails I've used some skeleton horde just to give those a bit of sort of weathering, and I've done this with the teeth as well. I'm not going to go into great detail with my base, but I've done it to match my Sons of Behemat army. So I've used Tuskor fur with a highlighting dry brush of Tau Light Ochre. I just wanted to show how effective dry brushing the different colors over this rock can come out to look. But you should do it to match the Destruction army that you're going to be using Kragnos in. And with that, Kragnos is complete. I hope you enjoy watching the video. I had a real blast painting Kragnos, and I'm looking forward to getting him onto the tabletop with my Sons of Behemat. Until next time, bye for now.